"Do you have a boyfriend?" the underboss asked. She said, "Not yet." And the most dangerous man in Chicago stopped breathing for half a second. That was the moment Ava Bennett realized some questions don't start conversations. They start wars. She was only 12 days into a job she couldn't afford to lose, standing beneath cold office lights with a stack of files in her arms, trying to look steady in a building where power moved quieter than fear. Then, one careless answer cracked something open in Dominic Hale, the man who owned the tower, the silence inside it, and maybe more than anyone dared say out loud. This story is different because it isn't just about obsession. It's about protection, buried promises, and what happens when love walks into a world built on danger. Stay with me to the end then, like this video, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The thing about a dangerous silence is that it never really ends. It follows you out of the room, settles under your skin, and waits there. Ava Bennett felt it all the way back to her desk. She set the folders down one by one, slower than she needed to because her hands had gone clumsy. The executive floor around her moved with its usual polished rhythm. Phones rang in muted bursts. Elevator doors opened and closed with a soft metallic sigh. Men in expensive suits crossed the corridor carrying tablets, contracts numbers that could shift entire blocks of the city by morning. Everything looked normal. Nothing felt normal. Across the hall, Dominic Hale's office door stayed shut. Ava stared at it for half a second too long, then forced herself to look at her screen. She had told herself when she moved to Chicago that she was done with men who made her nervous. Done with uncertainty. Done with rooms where she had to guess what people really meant. She had come for a job, a paycheck, a clean start in a city big enough to swallow the past if you moved fast and kept your head down. That was the plan. Then, 12 days into working at Hale Group, one teasing question from Mason Cole had turned a quiet morning into something she could still feel in her chest. "Do you have a boyfriend?" Not yet. And then Dominic Hale had looked at her like the answer mattered. Ava reached for her keyboard and tried to focus on the spreadsheet glowing in front of her. Names, numbers, schedules, neat rows and neat columns, things that stayed where you put them. Things that did not stare at you with dark, unreadable eyes from behind a polished office door. She was still trying to steady her breathing when Mason drifted back toward her desk with a paper cup in one hand and all the shameless amusement in the world on his face. He stopped beside her chair and tipped the cup toward her. Peace offering. Ava glanced at it. What is it? Coffee. The human soul in liquid form. She looked up at him. "You started this." He pressed a hand to his chest like she had wounded him. "I asked a harmless question. You asked a reckless question. That too." He gave her a grin. "But I was not the one who reacted like a man hearing wedding bells at a funeral." Ava nearly choked on nothing. She lowered her voice immediately. "Will you stop saying things like that? Why, they're accurate." "They are absolutely not accurate." Mason took a sip from his own cup, studying her with the kind of easy curiosity that came from a man who enjoyed trouble almost as much as he enjoyed being right. "You're new here, Ava, so let me help. Dominic Hale doesn't stop in hallways unless something important gets his attention. He doesn't lose control in public. And he definitely doesn't summon assistants into his office because somebody asked whether they were single. He didn't lose control." Mason lifted one brow. "That's what you call it?" Ava hated that her cheeks warmed. It was a misunderstanding. "Sure." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You looked at him. I was in the room with him. No, not saw him, looked at him." She turned back to her screen. "I have work to do." Mason laughed softly, like he had found the answer he wanted anyway. Then he straightened as the office line on her desk lit up. Ava reached for it too quickly. "Miss Bennett." Dominic's voice came through calm and low, stripped of the tension that had flashed in his office a few minutes ago. Somehow that only made her more alert. "Conference room in 20 minutes, he said. "Bring the revised acquisition packet. Sit beside me." Ava glanced toward his office door even though it was closed. Of course. The line clicked dead. Mason made a small sound through his nose. "Sit beside me." See, now that sounds personal. It sounds efficient. It sounds possessive. Ava shot him a look. Mason only smirked and pushed the extra coffee closer to her before walking away. She told herself not to drink it. She drank it anyway. By the time the meeting began, Ava had done what she had always done when life tilted unexpectedly. She organized herself. She checked every page in the packet twice, aligned the tabs clipped. The notes, smoothed her blouse once in the reflection of her dark computer screen, and stepped into the conference room with a face she hoped looked composed. The room itself looked like money felt. Glass walls, dark oak table, skyline spread beyond the windows in a sweep of steel and winter light. Lake Michigan lay in the distance like a sheet of cold, hammered metal. The men gathering around the table were older, louder, and richer than anyone Ava had ever worked near before. Some had the kind of silver hair that meant old power. Others had the watch collections and impatient eyes of men used to being obeyed without having to ask twice. Dominic stood at the head of the table speaking quietly with legal counsel. His jacket was buttoned. His tie was perfect. Whatever had flashed through him earlier was gone now, buried under the kind of control that made everyone else in the room seem looser, messier, more human by comparison. He looked up as Ava entered, just once, then toward the chair beside him. She took the seat without a word. The meeting began fast and stayed fast. Ava had thought Dominic would be the type of executive who dominated through intimidation alone. He was intimidating, yes, but that was not what made the room bend around him. It was precision. He listened the way some men hunted, not by making noise, but by waiting until weakness showed itself. He let people speak until they talked themselves into corners, then cut once and clean. A partner from New York tried to challenge a revised land valuation. Dominic said, "Your number assumes a tax concession the city never approved." The man opened his folder, frowned, and shuffled papers. Ava found the corrected page before anyone else did. She slid it under Dominic's hand without looking directly at him. His fingers brushed the edge of the paper, then stilled for the smallest second. He glanced down, took in the page, and continued speaking as if the room had never lost its rhythm. "Page 47, he said. "The final assessment is there. If we move on the old figure, we build a bad deal on a fantasy." The argument died. Later, when legal tried to soften a clause that would have given the other side too much room, Dominic leaned back in his chair and asked one question so quietly that everybody leaned in to hear it. "Do you want the contract to protect our position, or do you want it to sound polite?" Nobody answered. He didn't need one. Ava kept taking notes, her pulse slowly easing into the work. This part she understood. Numbers told truths people tried to hide. Rooms full of power still ran on timing detail and knowing when to speak. She could do this. She was doing this. Every time Dominic reached for a page, it was already there. Every time he needed a figure or date, she had it marked. Halfway through, he leaned toward her just enough to murmur last quarter shipping exposure. She turned pages without fumbling and placed the sheet beneath his hand. "Thank you," he said so low only she heard it. It should not have affected her. It did. When the meeting finally broke nearly 90 minutes later, the investors filed out in measured clusters, carrying their egos and unfinished opinions with them. Ava gathered her notes, stacking pages into order, while Dominic remained at the table reviewing the last of the marked documents. She rose to leave. "Miss Bennett." She stopped. He stood then, one hand resting on the back of his chair. Up close, without the table between them, his presence always seemed larger, like it reached the edges of whatever room he occupied. "You caught the tax error before legal did," he said. Ava tucked a loose strand of hair behind one ear. "It stood out. It stood out to you." She did not know what to say to that, so she went with the truth. "I didn't want you walking in blind." For the first time that day, something in his expression shifted. Not enough to call it a smile. Not that. Softer than that would have been more dangerous. "You didn't," he said. The silence after that line felt too full. Ava looked down at the files in her arms. "I'll finalize the meeting summary." "Do that." His voice remained steady, but his gaze had not quite moved on from her yet. And send me the revised packet before 5. Of course. She turned toward the door and nearly walked straight into Mason, who was leaning against the frame like he had been there long enough to enjoy himself. He glanced between them and let out a low whistle. Look at that. Day 12 and she's already saving the room. Dominic's eyes cooled by several degrees. Do you need something? Mason lifted both hands. I came bearing updates. Also admiration. Mainly for her. You never notice anybody this early. Ava started toward the door, mortified. Mason fell into step beside her in the hallway. That was impressive. She exhaled. You are exhausting, and yet you understand me. I don't. I survive you. Close enough. He walked with her back toward her desk, glancing sideways with that same troublemaking glint still alive in his eyes. You know what the best part was. Ava did not slow down. No. He said, thank you. Mason clutched at his heart. I almost called security to report suspicious behavior. She sat down and began sorting papers she had already sorted once. You really don't have enough to do. On the contrary. I do some of my best work annoying people into emotional honesty. Ava looked up at him flatly. Please find another hobby. He grinned. Never. But even Mason, for all his theatrics, could not distract her from the strange undercurrent that settled over the rest of the afternoon. Hale Group moved like a living machine. Assistants carried binders from floor to floor. Department heads ducked in and out of Dominic's office. Security stood at their stations with the alert stillness of men trained for more than checking guest badges. Phones rang. Emails piled up. Winter light shifted across the river outside. Still, every now and then, Ava became aware of Dominic in a way that had nothing to do with workflow. His office door would open and she would feel it before she saw him. He would step out to speak with legal or finance, and without meaning to, she would register the details she had no business noticing. The quiet authority in the way he walked. The way other men straightened when he approached. The roughness in his voice when he had been speaking too long without water. The fact that when he paused beside someone's desk he gave them his full attention, which somehow felt more unnerving than being ignored. Once she looked up from an email and found him looking in her direction through the glass wall of his office. Not staring. Not exactly. Watching. He looked away first. Ava told herself that should have made her feel better. It didn't. By 6:30, most of the floor had thinned out. The after-work rush downstairs would be filling the sidewalks by now. Somewhere below, taxis were leaning on horns, and the city was beginning its evening shift from business to appetite. Up here, the tower had gone quieter. Lights from the surrounding buildings blinked on, one by one, turning the windows into mirrors edged in gold. Ava rolled her shoulders and reached for the final folder she needed to deliver. Dominic's office door was half open. She stepped inside without knocking because she had learned quickly that if he wanted privacy, the door would be shut. He was standing behind his desk, not working. A small picture frame rested in his hand. For one suspended second, he did not know she was there. That was what stopped her. She had seen Dominic Hale command boardrooms strip weak arguments to bone and quiet men twice his age with a glance. She had seen him move through this building like every polished surface belonged to him because in a way that mattered, it did. She had not seen him look unguarded. The expression on his face as he stared at that photograph was not grief exactly. It was older than that, tighter. The kind of look a person wore when memory reached into the present without permission. He noticed her then and set the frame down too quickly inside the top drawer. The drawer slid shut with a controlled click. Sorry, Ava said, though she had not done anything except witness a second she had clearly not been meant to see. I brought the revised packet. He held her gaze for a beat longer than usual before stepping around the desk. Thank you. She extended the folder. He took it. What was that? She asked before she could stop herself. Dominic went still. A lesser man might have pretended not to understand. Dominic did not waste energy on weak evasions. An old photograph. Of family. His eyes lowered very briefly, then returned to hers. Of old business. There was something in the answer that told her not to ask again. Not because he was angry. Because whatever sat behind that drawer was not something he took out often. Ava nodded. I can finish the rest from my desk. I'll need you to stay another hour. That's fine. He shifted the packet in one hand and gave her a second folder from the credenza beside him. As she reached for it, their fingers touched. This time, the contact was not as accidental as the earlier brush in his office had been. Or maybe it only felt that way because the room was quieter, darker, closer to empty. Either way, neither of them moved immediately. His hand remained under the folder. So did hers. Ava's breath caught at the exact same moment Dominic's jaw tightened. For a second, the air seemed to thicken around the small point where their skin met. Then a voice came through the doorway. Boss, if this is a bad time, I want it officially noted that I knocked emotionally. Mason. Of course. They let go at once. Dominic turned all expression gone. What? Mason stepped in, holding his phone, and looking entirely too pleased with the timing of his own existence. Call from downstairs. Delivery conflict at the dock entrance. Security wants a decision. Dominic took a breath, slow and controlled, then nodded once. Tell Reed to reroute through service access and clear it with legal. Already did. Mason's eyes flicked toward Ava, then back to Dominic. I mainly came to enjoy the atmosphere. Get out. Mason flashed Ava an almost sympathetic grin and disappeared. She looked down at the folder in her hands so Dominic would not see the smile threatening the corner of her mouth. I should go finish this, she said. Yes. His voice had deepened somehow. Do that. Ava returned to her desk, but concentration came harder now. It was not just the memory of his hand or the strange gravity of that room after hours. It was the photograph. The way his face had changed when he thought he was alone. The feeling that there were whole, locked chambers inside Dominic Hale that the city saw only from the outside. Around 7:15, the last of the day staff finally filtered out. Mason left at some point after making a dramatic show of announcing his hunger to anyone within earshot. Finance was dark. Legal had one office light on near the corner. Security still moved with professional silence on the lower level visible through the open bank of elevators. Ava finished the summary, sent the revised notes, and began organizing the next day's schedule. The repetitive work helped. It always had. When the world became too loud inside her head, she made order out of whatever was in front of her. That was why the sound of Dominic's voice through the wall caught her attention immediately. His office door was not fully closed, just enough to muffle. Not enough to hide tone. He was on the phone. The version of Dominic most people saw used calm like a weapon. This voice was different, lower, heavier, less polished. A voice that belonged to the man beneath the public surface. I said no. A pause. Ava froze fingers resting on the keyboard. No, I don't want her involved. Her heartbeat stumbled. Another silence. Whoever was on the other end was talking long enough that Dominic moved away from the glass out of her line of sight. Then, he said sharper now, she has nothing to do with this. Ava should have looked away. She knew that. Knew what privacy was. Knew what lines not to cross. Still, something cold moved through her. Her. He could have meant anyone. There were women all over this city. People under his protection, perhaps. A sister she had never heard of, a client, a witness, somebody from that locked private world the building hinted at but never explained. But deep down she knew. The way you know certain storms are heading for you before they break. A floorboard shifted inside the office. The conversation ended. Ava snapped her eyes back to the computer screen a split second before the door opened. Dominic stood there, one hand still holding the phone, his expression unreadable. He saw immediately that she had heard enough to make guessing dangerous. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The office around them had gone almost completely still. Only the muted hum of the city remained far below and very far away. Then he said her name. Not Miss Bennett. Not in that measured professional tone he used when walls were up. Just low and direct. Ava. She looked at him. There was no point pretending. He knew it. She knew it. His gaze held hers for one quiet second, then shifted toward the open doorway behind him. Come in. And this time, when she stood and walked toward his office, it had nothing to do with work. Dominic closed the door behind her with a quiet, careful motion that somehow felt more serious than if he had slammed it. The city glowed through the glass behind him. Chicago at night looked like a lie told in gold and steel, beautiful from a distance, brutal up close. Ava stayed near the chair across from his desk but did not sit. "You heard enough," he said. It was not a question. Ava folded her arms not because she meant to look defensive, but because she needed somewhere to put her hands. "I heard you say you didn't want her involved." His expression did not change, but something sharpened behind his eyes. "And you assumed that meant you. Should I not have?" For 1 second, he said nothing. Then he crossed the room and stopped beside the desk instead of behind it, as though putting too much furniture between them would make honesty harder. "There are people watching this building," he said at last. "Not tourists, not competitors in the normal sense. People who look for weak points around me." Ava stared at him. "Around you?" "Yes. What does that mean exactly?" His jaw flexed once. "It means my life does not end at board meetings and development contracts. It means certain men like to collect information before they move. They study patterns, routines, faces, anyone who gets close enough to matter." The last line landed harder than the others. Ava tried to keep her voice level. "And you think I matter?" Something unreadable passed through his face, quick and gone. "I think you work 10 feet from my office on the executive floor. That is enough." It was not a real answer, and they both knew it. She took a breath. "Is this why security feels like an airport in this building?" His mouth almost moved, not quite a smile, not quite amusement. "Airports are less careful." Ava looked toward the window, then back at him. "You're serious." "I would not have said it if I wasn't." The room went very still. She had moved to Chicago for a better salary and a cleaner future, not to hear a man like Dominic Hale calmly explain that his enemies mapped the people around him. She knew enough about power to understand what he was not saying. Hale Group was polished in public, elegant, legitimate. But power like Dominic's did not come only from clean contracts and ribbon cuttings. There was another structure under this one, another language, another set of rules. And now she was standing in the middle of it. Ava looked at him more closely. "Am I in danger?" "No." The answer came too fast. Her eyes narrowed. That sounded rehearsed. His gaze held hers without blinking. "What I am telling you is that nothing is going to reach you." That is not the same answer. It is the one that matters. She should have pushed harder. Any sensible person would have. Instead, she became absurdly aware of the fact that he had not denied protecting her, had not softened it, had not framed it as office policy or general concern for staff safety. He had said it like a promise. Dominic moved around the desk then and picked up a file, setting it down again without opening it. "Until I know more, I want you close to this floor. No unnecessary trips. No leaving with anyone I haven't cleared. If you need to go somewhere, tell me." Ava let out a breath that sounded too close to a laugh. "You realize that sounds controlling." He looked at her with flat honesty. "It is controlling." She blinked. Most men in his position would have dressed it up, called it caution, suggested it softly. Dominic simply stood there in the low office light and admitted exactly what he was doing. Ava shook her head once. "You can't actually expect me to hear that and not ask questions." "Ask them. Who is watching the building?" He was quiet for a beat. "Men who prefer leverage to confrontation." "Why?" His eyes darkened. "Because direct conflict is expensive." "That tells me almost nothing." "It tells you enough." Ava looked away, frustrated despite herself. "That may work on everyone else here. It doesn't work on you." He said it without heat, almost with a hint of weary recognition. "I've noticed." That caught her off guard. She lowered her voice. "Then give me something real. Why are you doing this for me?" Dominic went very still. Outside the office, the floor had gone almost silent. The hum of the city rose faintly through the glass. Somewhere far below, a siren passed and faded. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. "Because I would rather make you angry than leave you exposed." Ava felt that answer in her chest before she processed it in her head. She looked down for a second and hated that she needed the second. When she raised her eyes again, he was still watching her with the same hard steadiness, but there was something else there now. Not softness exactly. More dangerous than softness. Restraint. "All right," she said quietly. "I heard you." Dominic nodded once. The tension did not leave the room. It simply shifted shape. Ava moved toward the door, then stopped with her hand near the brass handle. "If this has anything to do with me personally, I need you to tell me." His gaze settled on her profile. "If it does," he said, "I will." It was not enough. It was what she got. She left a minute later and rode the train home with his words following her into every tunnel and station light. People watching this building. Anyone who gets close enough to matter. Nothing is going to reach you. By the time she unlocked her apartment door on the north side, the city had gone colder. Wind rattled something metallic in the alley below. She kicked off her shoes, dropped her bag onto the couch, and stood in the dark with one hand still on the strap because suddenly her small, ordinary apartment felt like a place from another life. She had spent years building herself into someone practical. Someone who trusted what she could measure. Rent, groceries, transit time, deadlines. She did not trust men with unreadable faces and voices like low thunder. She definitely did not trust men who could make danger sound like a personal inconvenience. And yet, when she closed her eyes, the thing she felt most sharply was not fear. It was the memory of him saying he would rather make her angry than leave her exposed. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. A text from an unknown number. "You get home okay?" Ava frowned and typed back before she could think better of it. "Who is this?" The reply came instantly. "Mason, do not sound so disappointed." She exhaled through her nose. "How did you get my number?" "I have talents. Also, HR is a very trusting department." She could almost hear his grin through the screen. Before she answered, another message came. "Boss asked." Ava stared at that one a little too long. A ridiculous warmth moved through her, followed immediately by irritation at herself for letting it. "Tell him yes," she typed. "And tell him to stop sending other people to ask." Mason answered with insulting speed. "Oh, this is already my favorite story." Ava threw the phone onto the couch and went to shower in water hot enough to burn the day off her skin. It did not help. Sleep came late and shallow. Every time she drifted near it, she saw dark, glass city lights Dominic's face half-shadowed by his office lamp. She heard that calm, implacable voice saying close enough to matter. The next morning, she came in early on purpose. Chicago looked sharper at that hour. Clean edges, pale winter sun reflecting off the river. The lobby of Hale Group smelled faintly of stone, expensive coffee, and cold air carried in from revolving doors. Security nodded her through. Upstairs, the executive floor had not fully filled yet. A few assistants were logging in. Cleaning staff rolled the last of their carts toward service access. Silence still held the corridors before the day put weight on them. Ava exhaled, set her bag down, and turned on her monitor. Morning. She nearly jumped out of her skin. Mason was leaning against the side of her desk with impossible casualness, and a paper bag from a bakery she could not afford. One day, she said, pressing a hand to her chest, "You're going to get punched." He considered that. "That seems fair." She sank into her chair. "Why are you here this early?" "To observe." He set the paper bag down in front of her. "And because I am a generous man." Blueberry muffin. Ava looked at him suspiciously. "Why, because you look tired." "I'm not tired." Mason tilted his head. "Your eyes say you spent half the night thinking about a certain controlled psychopath." Before she could answer, the elevator doors opened. Dominic stepped out. Dark overcoat. Charcoal suit beneath. No tie today. Just the open collar of a white shirt under the coat, like he had dressed fast or had given up pretending comfort mattered. His gaze moved across the floor, once efficient and assessing before settling on Ava. The whole room seemed to tighten by instinct. "Good morning, Miss Bennett," he said. Ava hated the way her pulse answered him. "Good morning." Mason made a soft, theatrical sound under his breath that, fortunately, only she heard. Dominic approached, stopping on the other side of her desk. Up close, the cold from outdoors still clung faintly to his coat. "I need the revised logistics schedule before 11, he said. "And sit in on operations at 10, beside me." Mason looked at the ceiling as if in prayer. Ava kept her face neutral, of course. Dominic's gaze held hers a fraction longer than necessary. "If anything feels off today, you tell me." The words were quiet enough not to carry. Mason heard them anyway because apparently the devil rewarded the observant. Ava nodded. "I will." Dominic moved toward his office. Only after the door closed behind him did Mason let himself grin. He said, "If anything feels off." Ava opened her laptop with slightly more force than required. "Don't. He's one suspicious glance away from assigning you your own security detail. He already has security in the building." Mason leaned in, dropping the humor just slightly. "Not what I mean." Ava looked at him then. For the first time since she'd met him, there was a trace of seriousness in his expression. "You should listen when he says stay close." Something in her face must have shifted because Mason straightened and brought the lightness back like a stage curtain. "Also, eat the muffin before I do." The morning disappeared into movement. Operations at 10. Legal at 11. A quick review of shipping exposure and site schedules just before noon. Ava spent most of it within Dominic's orbit exactly as instructed. Beside him in conference rooms. Across from him in briefings. At his shoulder when he crossed the hall to speak with the department heads. The strange thing was how quickly that closeness began to feel natural. She learned the rhythm of his work without being taught. When he wanted silence, he grew even quieter. When he was about to cut through someone's weak argument, the fingers of one hand went still against the table. When he was tired, his voice roughened at the edges but never lost precision. He noticed everything. Not just figures and contracts, but hesitation, misplaced confidence, who looked at him too long, who avoided looking at him at all. At one point during a tense review of transport costs, a senior manager quoted the wrong number from memory. Ava caught the discrepancy, slid the correct report toward Dominic, and watched his eyes flick down to it before he corrected the room in a tone so calm it made the manager look foolish without ever raising a hand. When the room cleared, Dominic remained seated. Ava gathered her notes. "You don't miss much," he said. She glanced up. "I try not to." "Why Hale Group?" The question caught her off guard. She tucked papers into a folder to give herself half a second. "That sounds like an interview question." "It is." She looked at him more carefully. "Chicago pays better than Milwaukee." That's practical, not honest. She surprised herself by answering honestly anyway. "Because I got tired of being small, where everybody already knew my life." She closed the folder and held it against her chest. "I wanted somewhere I could earn my way forward without the past in the room." Dominic watched her very quietly after that. Then he said, "Chicago remembers less. It punishes harder." Ava almost smiled. "That sounds encouraging. It sounds true." It did. By noon, she was starving. She stood from her desk and reached for her coat, grateful for the excuse to leave the floor for 20 minutes and breathe air not charged by Dominic Hale's presence. She had made it exactly 3 steps toward the elevator when his office door opened. "Where are you going?" Ava turned. "Lunch." "I'm coming." She blinked. "Why?" He was already reaching for his coat. "I need coffee." Mason materialized out of nowhere because apparently he had evolved beyond normal human entrances. "He never drinks coffee at lunch," Mason said helpfully. Dominic did not even look at him. "I do today." Ava stared at Dominic for a second. "You are absolutely following me." His mouth tightened in what might have been annoyance or reluctant surrender. "Yes." Mason made a delighted choking sound. "Get back to work," Dominic said. Mason spread his hands. "I support romance and caffeine in equal measure. Leave." Ava bit the inside of her cheek hard enough to keep from laughing as she stepped into the elevator with Dominic beside her. They rode down in silence among mirrored walls and soft instrumental music that somehow made the tension worse. She was aware of every inch of space between them. of the fact that he stood slightly closer to the elevator doors than he needed to, like a barrier placed there out of instinct rather than intention. The cafe downstairs sat just off the lobby, behind a wall of glass and brass, all polished counters and clean white cups. Ava ordered soup and half a sandwich. Dominic ordered water. She turned to him flatly, coffee. He met her gaze without shame. Changed my mind. They took a table in the corner. Ava had barely sat down before she noticed it again, the way his eyes moved around the room even while speaking to her. Not distracted. Trained. "You're doing it again," she said. "Doing what?" Scanning exits like someone's about to come through the pastry case with a knife. A shadow of amusement touched his face. "That is very specific. It's also what you're doing." He looked at her, then really looked. "I keep track of things." "Why?" "Because people are easiest to hurt when they feel safe." The line was so matter-of-fact that it silenced her. A server passed near their table. Dominic's gaze tracked him and moved on. At another table, 2 men in suits from a neighboring tower laughed too loudly over market reports. A woman in a camel coat glanced at Dominic twice and pretended she had not. Ava lowered her spoon. "Do you ever relax?" He gave that some thought. "Rarely." "That sounds exhausting." "It is." The honesty in it pulled a softer answer out of her. "You don't have to watch me eat soup." He held her gaze. "I know." The air between them changed. Ava felt it the way she had begun to feel all the shifts around him. Tiny changes in tone and stillness, in the shape of silence. Then a man in a navy coat walked past their table and looked at her for one beat too long. Dominic's posture altered instantly. Not dramatic. More dangerous than dramatic. His hand went still against the table. His eyes followed the man until he disappeared near the lobby doors. Ava watched him. "Do you know him?" "No." "You look like you want to." "I don't like the way he looked at you." The answer was so blunt that heat rushed through her before she could stop it. She looked down at her untouched soup. "You can't react to everybody who notices me." His voice dropped. "Watch me." Ava laughed softly despite herself, and that seemed to break something taut in him because the severity in his face eased by a degree. He leaned back, studying her for a moment. "Are you afraid of me?" he asked. The question came from nowhere and from somewhere much deeper than the conversation they were having. Ava looked at him carefully. A man like Dominic Hale could be terrifying. He probably was to half the city. But fear was not what she felt when he looked at her. Overwhelmed, yes. Unsettled, definitely. Seen in ways she had not agreed to and did not entirely know how to resist. "No," she said. His gaze did not move. "You should answer that carefully." "I am." A long silence passed between them. Then he spoke so quietly she almost thought she imagined it. "You matter, Ava." Her heartbeat stumbled so hard she had to set her spoon down. He did not look away. Did not soften the line with context or professionalism, or any of the excuses available to him. Just let it stand. Ava's voice came out softer than she intended. "That's a dangerous thing to say to someone." A flicker moved in his eyes, "I know." Neither of them touched the food after that. When they finally stood to leave, the whole city felt slightly off-center. Back upstairs, the afternoon darkened early behind winter clouds. Ava worked at her desk, trying to recover some sense of normal gravity, while Dominic remained in meetings for most of the next 2 hours. Once, through the glass wall of his office, she saw him stop mid-conversation with Grant Hale and look toward her desk as if checking that she was still there. Another hour passed. Then, security called the executive floor. Ava was the one who answered. The guard downstairs sounded composed but not casual. "Miss Bennett, we had a visitor asking questions about personnel. Nothing urgent. Mr. Hale requested we log anything unusual." Ava's fingers tightened around the receiver. What kind of questions? A name. Department placement. Length of employment. She swallowed. "Whose?" A small pause. "Yours." The world went very quiet around that one word. She thanked the guard and hung up. A second later, Dominic's office door opened. He took one look at her face and knew. "Inside," he said, And Ava went because by then even fear felt less dangerous than the distance between them. Dominic shut the office door and turned the lock with a quiet click. It was a small sound, clean, controlled. For some reason, it made Ava's pulse jump harder than the call from security. He stood across from her for half a second like a man sorting 10 thoughts at once and trusting none of them. Grant Hale was already in the room near the credenza dark suit, immaculate hands loosely folded in front of him. Where Mason carried chaos like an expensive accessory, Grant carried stillness. The kind that usually meant bad news had already been measured, weighed, and brought upstairs intact. A file sat on Dominic's desk, thin, old, worn at the edges. Ava looked from the file to Dominic. "Somebody downstairs asked about me." "Yes. Why?" Dominic did not answer immediately. That was answer enough to make something cold move down her spine. Grant stepped forward first, as if he had been chosen for this part because he knew how to place sharp truths more gently than Dominic ever could. "The name Bennett came up with someone we've watched before," Grant said. "Not a direct threat. Not yet. But enough that Dominic asked us to pull everything we had." Ava stared at the file. Everything we had. The phrase should not have felt personal. It did. She looked at Dominic again. "Everything you had on who?" His eyes held hers. "On your father." The room seemed to lose depth for a second. Ava heard the city outside. Distant traffic. The building's low electrical hum. Somewhere down the hall a door opened and closed. All of it strangely far away now, like sound traveling through water. "My father," she repeated. Dominic gave one small nod. Ava laughed once under her breath, not because anything was funny, but because disbelief sometimes sounded too much like it. "No," she shook her head. "No, I don't even know where my father is. He left when I was little. I barely remember him." Grant's expression softened by a degree. "We know." Ava turned toward him sharply. "Then, why is there a file?" Dominic crossed to the desk, picked up the folder, and held it for a moment without opening it. The muscles in his hand flexed once against the paper. "Because your father crossed paths with my world a long time ago," he said. "Closer than he should have." Ava stood very still. The words should not have surprised her. Not after everything she had seen in this building. Not after security calls and half-spoken warnings and the way men looked at Dominic like he carried both fortune and ruin in the same hand. Still, hearing him say "my world" felt like stepping onto something that moved underfoot. She looked from Dominic to Grant. Start at the beginning. Grant glanced at Dominic, got a slight nod, and opened the file on the desk. Inside were copies, old employment records, a few police incident reports, a black and white photo of a loading dock somewhere industrial and anonymous. A driver manifest with names she did not recognize. One line had Daniel Bennett typed across it in faded ink. For a second, seeing her father's name in paper form hit harder than hearing it. "Your father worked transport and deliveries on the South Side years ago," Grant said. "He wasn't a violent man, he wasn't formally part of anything, but some of the routes he handled were tied to a crew that eventually ended up aligned with people hostile to Dominic." Ava's eyes stayed on the page. "I don't understand," she said. "You're saying he worked near them?" "Yes, and that matters now because somebody recognized my last name." "Yes." She looked up. "Why?" This time Dominic answered. "Because names last longer than good intentions." Silence fell. Ava stared at him. "You knew my name when you hired me." There it was, the question that had been waiting for its shape. Dominic's jaw tightened, but he did not look away. Yes, something in her chest dropped. Not because he had lied exactly. Dominic had never told her he did not know. He had simply let her walk through the door and begin building a life in the shadow of a truth he had already recognized. When she asked quietly, "The day your resume crossed my desk, you remembered it just from seeing it." "I remember a lot." Grant said nothing. He did not need to. The silence between her and Dominic had become too charged to admit a third voice. Ava took a step back from the desk. "So this whole time she said you knew who I was." Dominic's expression hardened, not with anger, but with the effort of staying exact. I knew your last name. I confirmed the connection after your interview, and you still hired me. You got the job because you earned it. That is not the part I'm asking about." She had not raised her voice, but the room felt sharper all the same. Dominic set one palm against the desk. "I hired you because you were qualified, and because my father once came near your world. Yes." Ava laughed again, this time with a little bitterness in it. "That sounds like two different reasons." His eyes darkened. "Then let me be clearer." He moved around the desk and came closer, not so close that she had to step back, but close enough that she could see the tiredness behind the control in his face. "At first, he said I made sure you stayed here because I wanted eyes on the situation, because I knew enough about the past to know your name might mean something to the wrong people." At first, the words landed heavily. Ava looked at him without blinking. "And now," Dominic inhaled slowly, "now I keep you close because I don't seem capable of doing anything else. That should not have mattered in the middle of all this. It mattered too much." Ava's pulse beat hard against the inside of her wrists. She hated that her body could hear his voice and forget for one weak, dangerous second that she was angry. She crossed her arms tighter. "What exactly happened with my father?" Grant looked to Dominic again. This time, Dominic answered without waiting. "Your father drove shipments for men who looked legitimate until they didn't. He found out too late who they were tied to. By then, he was already in enough to know he needed out." Ava swallowed, "So he ran." "No," Dominic said, and the force in the word made her look at him. "He tried to protect his family." Something shifted in his tone then. Not enough to make it tender. Enough to make it personal. "He came to me," Dominic said. "Not because he trusted my name, because he had run out of doors to knock on." Ava stared at him. The world narrowed until there was only the desk, the file, Dominic's face, and the sound of her own breathing. "He came to you." "Yes. For what?" "For help." Her throat went tight. Dominic's gaze did not move from hers. "He wanted out," he said. "For his wife. For his daughter." He knew enough by then to understand the men around him would use both if he tried to disappear without protection. Ava's voice came out thinner than she wanted. "And you helped him?" "Yes." The office seemed suddenly too warm. She turned away, walked 2 steps toward the window, then stopped there with the whole river and city beyond the glass. Cars moved like lit beads along the roads below. People were out there buying groceries, heading home, meeting friends for drinks, existing in clean, simple narratives she suddenly envied. Behind her, no one spoke. Ava put a hand against the cool glass. "I spent years thinking he left because it was easier," she said quietly. "My mother never said much. Every time I asked, she would just say he loved us in the way he could. I used to hate that sentence." Dominic's voice came from behind her, low and steady. "He didn't leave because it was easier." Ava closed her eyes briefly. "Then why didn't he come back?" No one answered right away. When Dominic finally did the truth, and it felt heavier than anything else he had said. "Because sometimes staying gone is the only protection a man has left to offer." Ava turned then, and the look on his face made something in her anger fracture. He was not defending a stranger. He was remembering one. Grant quietly closed the file. "I'll give you both a minute," he said. Neither of them looked at him, but a second later the office door opened and shut again, leaving the room thick with silence and evening light. Ava stood by the window and tried to put her thoughts into any order at all. Her father had not vanished into a clean abandonment. He had stepped into something dangerous, tried to pull back, then reached the one man in Chicago powerful enough to bury his family's name under concrete and distance. And that man had been Dominic. The same Dominic who had interviewed her without ever saying a word. The same Dominic who watched her too closely, kept her too near, reacted too sharply whenever another man stood in her orbit. She turned toward him slowly. "How much did you know when I came here?" "Enough." "That still isn't an answer." His expression remained composed, but his eyes had gone rougher, somehow stripped of polish. "I knew your father asked for protection. I knew he disappeared after I arranged it. I knew your mother moved north and changed patterns often enough not to be easy to find. And when I saw your resume, I knew life had a sense of humor I've never appreciated." Ava held his gaze. "You should have told me." "Yes." The immediate agreement startled her. She blinked. "Then why didn't you?" Dominic looked down, once then back at her. "Because I did not want your first day in that building to become a story about your father." The answer pressed into her chest in a place she had not prepared to feel it. "I wanted you to be hired for yourself," he said. "And because once you were here, I did not want fear making decisions for you." Ava let out a breath. "So you made them for me instead." A shadow moved through his face. For a while, he said, "Yes." There it was again. That impossible thing about him. No scrambling, no cheap defense. Just the truth clean enough to cut. Ava looked away because the honesty made it harder to stay angry in the simple way she wanted. "That is not better." "I know." She gave a short, humorless laugh and pressed her fingers to her forehead. "Do you have any idea how insane this sounds from my side?" Dominic's voice softened only a shade. "Probably less than I should." "That's not reassuring." He took one step closer. "Ava." The way he said her name made her look at him before she meant to. "I was careful because of your father," he said. "I am careful now because of you." Something in the room changed. The city still moved outside. Lights blinked on deeper in the skyline. Somewhere in the building, a printer started up, ran for a few seconds, then stopped. All normal sounds. None of them reached the space between them. Ava lowered her hand. "You don't get to say things like that after all this and expect me not to react." His eyes stayed fixed on hers. "React then." The invitation in it was not a challenge. It was worse. It was permission. She took a step toward him before she had decided to. "That answer outside your office," she said. "When Mason asked if I had a boyfriend, you looked at me like it hurt." A flicker crossed his face. He could have denied it. He did not. "It did." Ava's breath caught. "Why?" He gave a low exhale. "Because hearing you say 'not yet' sounded too much like a door I was trying not to want open." The honesty of it stunned her into stillness. She had spent days trying to name what lived under his stare. Control, possessiveness, concern. Some dangerous mixture of all three. She had not expected him to hand her the truth in a sentence that bare. Ava shook her head once, very slightly. "You are my boss." "Yes." "This is a terrible idea." "Yes." "You keep saying yes like that fixes it." "It doesn't." His voice dropped lower. "It just means I'm not going to insult you by pretending I haven't thought about it." Her heart was beating too hard now, too high in her chest. She should leave, she thought. Walk out. Go home. Take the train with her coat buttoned to the throat and sit by the window and think until dawn. Let this be too much. Let it stay impossible. Instead, she asked the worst question available to her. "How long?" Dominic's gaze did not move from her face. "I noticed you the day you corrected me in your second meeting," he said. "I knew I had a problem the day I started looking for reasons to keep you on this floor." Ava almost smiled despite the pressure in her chest. "That was fast." "For me," he said quietly, "it was slow." She laughed once, then softly, and without meaning to, and the sound changed something in him. His face eased only for a second into a tenderness so restrained it was almost painful to witness. He lifted one hand as if he meant to touch her, then stopped halfway. Ava looked at that halted motion. "Why do you always stop?" The question seemed to hit him somewhere deep. His hand lowered, but not all the way. "Because if I don't," he said, "I am not sure I stop at all." The room went silent around that sentence. Ava stood there with the whole city at her back, and that one line between them like a lit wire. Then she took the last step herself. Not dramatic, not fearless, just honest. She moved close enough that she could see the slight roughness at the edge of his jaw where the day had outlasted precision. Close enough to feel the heat coming off him in the cool office air. Dominic did not move. Every bit of him had gone still. Ava looked up at him. For me, too. The confession left her mouth so quietly she almost did not recognize it as her own. But he heard it. She saw the impact of it in the way his breath changed, in the way his eyes darkened. Not with anger, not with control, but with something more human and much more dangerous. Slowly, as though giving her every chance in the world to walk away, Dominic reached up and brushed a strand of hair back from her face. His fingertips skimmed her temple. Ava closed her eyes for half a second at the touch. When she opened them again, he was watching her like restraint had become an active form of pain. "Ava," he said. Just her name. Nothing else. She did not step back. Neither did he. The distance between them became almost nothing. He looked at her mouth once, then returned to her eyes with the discipline of a man still trying to be better than his own wanting. Ava's voice barely rose above a whisper. "If you ask me to leave right now, I probably will." His hand slid from her temple to the curve just below her ear, light enough to be reverent, tense enough to betray how much it cost him. "I'm not going to ask you to leave." That was the last clear thought she had. She lifted onto her toes and kissed him. For one shattered heartbeat, he did not react as if the reality of it had outrun even him. Then Dominic's free hand came to her waist, firm and careful at once, and he kissed her back. It was not rough. It was not rushed. It was slow, in the way storms are slow when they have been gathering for days. All that control she had seen in boardrooms, hallways, elevators sharpened not into restraint now, but into precision. He kissed her like he was still trying to memorize the line between wanting and losing his balance. Like he had spent too much time refusing this exact moment to waste it with carelessness. Ava's fingers curled into the front of his shirt. His hand tightened once at her waist. Warmth moved through her so fast it almost hurt. Not just heat. Relief. Recognition. The strange dizzy rightness of finally touching the thing that had been living between them in every glance and half-spoken sentence. When they pulled apart, it was only far enough to breathe. Dominic rested his forehead lightly against hers. His voice when it came was rougher than she had ever heard it. "I shouldn't have done that." Ava was still catching her breath. "That's not what happened." A sound almost like a laugh escaped him, though it carried more disbelief than humor. "No," he said softly. "It isn't." She opened her eyes fully and found him still there, still close, still looking at her as if every wall he had built had just taken a direct hit. "You kissed me back," she said. "Yes, and now." His thumb moved once against her side. "Now I am trying very hard to think clearly." She surprised herself by smiling. That finally did it. A real answer touched his mouth, small, brief, but real enough to change his entire face. It made him look younger and somehow more dangerous at once. A sharp knock sounded at the door. They both went still. Another knock. Then Mason's voice through the wood. "Before anyone yells, I would like it on record that I knocked like a gentleman." Ava closed her eyes and let out one helpless breath of laughter. Dominic looked upward for a second as if privately negotiating with heaven. "Come in," he said, voice flat again, though one hand had not quite left her waist yet. Mason pushed the door open, took one look at them, and froze in theatrical satisfaction. "Well," he said, "that explains a lot." "Get to the point," Dominic said. Mason's grin faded, not entirely, but enough. "We found the man from downstairs. Or rather, Grant did. Name is Nathan Cross. He didn't stay long, but he wanted her name noticed." Ava felt Dominic's hand shift, placing her just slightly behind the line of his body by instinct alone. Mason noticed. Of course he did. "So that's happening exactly the way it looks," he murmured, then got serious again. "Cross is expected at the Hale Foundation Gala tomorrow night." Dominic's expression hardened instantly. "Who invited him?" "Board sponsor list," Mason said. "He bought proximity like he always does." Ava looked between them. "Who is he?" "A man who enjoys old leverage," Dominic said. "And my father's name is Leverage." "Yes." The answer dropped cold into the room. Mason glanced at Ava, then at Dominic, suddenly more careful than usual. "Grant's pulling the rest of the archive now. We'll know by morning if Cross found a headline or a weapon." Ava hated that those sounded like equally normal options in their world. Dominic released her only enough to turn toward Mason fully. "Double security on arrivals. Nobody gets near her without clearance." Mason's gaze flicked once more between them. Amusement returning at the edges because apparently he could not help himself even in tension. "Understood." He stepped backward toward the door, then paused. "For what it's worth," he said lightly, "I knew this was coming." Mason Dominic said. Right, leaving. The door shut. Silence settled again, but it was a different silence now. Charged in more than one direction. The warmth of the kiss still lived in Ava's skin. So did the renewed weight of her father's name, the file on the desk. The knowledge that another man had come downstairs looking for her with deliberate timing. Dominic turned back to her. For 1 second, neither of them spoke. Then he reached up and touched the side of her face very gently, like he was making sure she was still here in front of him, and not something the last 10 minutes had invented. You should go home. Ava searched his expression. Do you want me to? No, the answer came instantly. That is precisely why I'm saying it. She let out a slow breath. Somehow that made sense. She nodded once. All right, but neither of them moved right away. Ava looked toward the old file still lying open on the desk, toward her father's faded name, toward the life she had walked into, thinking it was brand new. Then back at Dominic. There's more you haven't told me. His face gave nothing away this time, but she knew she was right. Yes, he said. Ava held his gaze. Then don't shut me out of it. Something shifted in his eyes at that. Not surprise. Something more like reluctant respect, edged with feeling. I'll tell you what matters. She stepped closer one last time, enough that the air changed again between them. You don't get to decide that alone anymore. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, very quietly, almost like an admission pulled from somewhere deep, he said, That may be the first order I've ever wanted to disobey. Ava's pulse answered him. She picked up her coat, still warm from the office, and slipped it on under his gaze. At the door, she paused with her hand on the handle and looked back. Dominic stood where she was leaving him, one hand resting on the desk beside the open file city light cutting a sharp line along his shoulders. He looked less like the man who ran half of Chicago in silence, more like a man caught between an old promise and something far more dangerous. Want. Ava opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The executive floor had gone mostly dark. Mason leaned against her desk, checking his phone, but he looked up the moment she emerged. His eyes moved over her face once, quick and perceptive, and for all his usual teasing, whatever he saw there made him soften. I'll walk you down, he said. Ava nodded. They crossed the quiet corridor together. At the elevator, she glanced back without meaning to. Through the glass wall of his office, Dominic was still standing exactly where she had left him, watching her go. Ava did not sleep much that night. She lay on top of her blankets with the city leaking pale light through the blinds, one hand over her stomach staring at the ceiling as if there might be an answer written there if she stayed awake long enough. Every time she closed her eyes, the same pieces returned in a different order. Her father's name inside an old file. Dominic saying he had recognized her resume. The slow, impossible certainty of his mouth against hers. She tried to be angry first because anger was easier to sort. He had known something fundamental about her life before she did. He had made decisions around her without giving her the chance to choose. Any sane woman should have started there and stayed there. Instead, she kept returning to the expression on his face when he spoke about her father. To the way his control had cracked not into carelessness, but into truth. To the fact that he had told her exactly enough to wound himself in the telling. By morning, she had not reached peace, only exhaustion. Chicago woke gray and sharp. The river cut through the city like cold steel under the winter sky. Ava dressed carefully, not for him, she told herself, but because control had to live somewhere, and today the easiest place to put it was in smooth fabric, steady hands, and a face that said she had not spent half the night unraveling. The moment she stepped onto the executive floor, she felt the difference. Not panic, not chaos. Tighter than that. Security stood more visibly than usual near the elevator bank. Men she had seen before were suddenly positioned where sightlines mattered. One near reception. One near the end of the corridor. One lingering by the glass conference room as though checking messages while his eyes tracked reflections in every polished surface. Mason was at her desk before she had set down her bag. Morning, he said, too casual by half. Ava looked at him. That tone means something is wrong. He considered denying it, then gave up. That tone means Dominic had 3 calls before 8, and none of them improved his mood. Is Nathan Cross one of those calls? Mason's expression shifted. You were listening yesterday. I was alive yesterday. He huffed a laugh. Fair. Ava glanced toward Dominic's office. The blinds were half open. She could see his silhouette moving inside phone to his ear head slightly bowed as he listened to somebody say something that clearly displeased him. What do you know about Cross? She asked. Mason rested one hip against her desk, folding his arms. Enough to dislike his face. That is not information. It is in my world. She kept looking at him until he relented. He deals in old loyalties and older dirt. Likes to make money off names that should have stayed buried. Never starts the fire if he can stand close enough to warm his hands. Ava felt a chill slide beneath her ribs. So he came looking for me because of my father, maybe. Mason's voice lost its playfulness entirely. Or because he guessed your name would matter to Dominic. Both are bad. She hated that her first instinct at that was not fear for herself, but a strange, painful awareness of Dominic in the next room, carrying too much with too little visible effort. Mason pushed a paper cup toward her. Drink this before you ask me another question I'll answer too honestly. She took the coffee because refusing it would not change anything. At 10, Dominic called her in. He was standing by the window when she entered, suit jacket off, sleeves rolled once at the forearms. The city behind him looked pale and expensive and very far away. He turned at the sound of the door closing. For a second, no one spoke. What lived between them now had altered the room permanently. It was there in the quiet, in the fact that she noticed his tie was missing, in the way his eyes went first to her face and stayed there long enough to make everything else feel secondary. You slept, he said. Ava nearly laughed. That is generous. Something close to regret crossed his face. You should have taken today off. And done what? Panicked, more efficiently, from my apartment. His mouth tightened, not with irritation but with acceptance that she was not wrong. I want you with me tonight, he said. The directness of it should have startled her by now. It did not. It only made her more aware of how quiet his office was, of how carefully he had chosen the words. The Gala, she said. Yes, because it's safer. Yes. Ava studied him. Only because it's safer. He held her gaze. No. That one word changed the air. He crossed toward the desk and picked up a black folder, then seemed to think better of it, and set it down again untouched. Cross is likely to be there, he said. If he wanted your name noticed, he may try to do it publicly. If he does, I need to be close enough to manage the room before it becomes something else. And if I say I don't want to go, his eyes did not move from hers. Then you don't go. The answer was immediate, certain, not the answer of a man used to forcing outcomes. Ava looked at him more closely. There was fatigue at the edges today, hidden badly because bad hiding on Dominic still looked better than composure on most men. He had probably spent the night tightening security, calling lawyers, looking into records she had not known existed until yesterday. He was asking her to come because he thought he could protect her there. He was also asking because he wanted her near him. The second truth sat quietly in the room, undeniable now. I'll go, she said. Something in his shoulders eased a fraction. All right. Ava stepped closer to the desk, then stopped. Dominic. The use of his first name made something flicker in his expression. Yes. What exactly am I walking into tonight? He took a breath. A room full of people who think power makes them important. Some of them are. Most aren't. A few will pretend not to recognize you and look twice anyway. One or two may know enough to be dangerous if they're ignored. That sounds comforting. I'm not trying to comfort you. He paused. I'm trying to keep you prepared. She nodded once. Then, because there was no point pretending last night had not happened, she asked the thing sitting heaviest between them. Are we supposed to act like nothing changed? For the first time all morning, Dominic looked briefly less than controlled. Not weak. Human. You can act however you need to. That was not an answer. It was the most honest one I have right now. Ava let out a breath. You keep doing that. Doing what? Refusing easy lies. His gaze lowered to her mouth for the briefest second, then returned to her eyes. "I don't know how to be easy with you." It would have been wiser not to react. She did anyway. Something warm and dangerous moved through her, not because the line was polished, but because it clearly was not. It sounded like the truth arriving uninvited. A soft knock came at the door. Mason entered without waiting because boundaries were clearly decorative to him. "Grant's downstairs with event security," he said. "Press list is larger than expected." Dominic's face hardened. "Why?" "Rumors." Mason glanced at Ava, then back to Dominic. Nothing specific yet, just enough noise to make people curious. Ava understood immediately. A name had started to move. Not fully, not publicly, but enough. Her stomach tightened. Dominic noticed. He always noticed. "Get me the finalized entry routes," he said to Mason. "Already on your desk." "Then leave." Mason spread his hands, happy to be valued. When the door shut behind him, silence returned again. Ava looked toward the desk, toward the stack of schedules and security notes and quiet preparations for war disguised as philanthropy. Then back at him. "I'm still angry with you," she said. Dominic nodded once. "I know. I'm also going tonight." His eyes held hers. "I know that too." She should have left it there. Instead, she asked, "Does it bother you?" "What?" "That I'm angry." The answer came low. "No, it bothers me that you have reason to be." That stayed with her all day. The office moved around the Gala by afternoon, all elegant logistics and expensive urgency. Dress bags arrived. Board confirmations rolled in. Floral revisions were approved and unapproved in the span of 10 minutes. PR sent a polished statement about community investment and legacy giving. Legal sent 3 separate reminders about donor disclosures. Somewhere, under all the clean language, everyone was preparing for an evening where reputation itself would be the main currency on the floor. Ava kept working because work was the only stable surface available. She sat in on final operations briefings, updated arrival orders, screened changes to guest seating, answered calls, sent revised notes, all while remaining aware of Dominic as if part of her had tuned permanently to his frequency. He moved through the day with unusual precision even for him. Quieter, sharper, less patience for weak questions. Twice she caught him looking at her from across a room with the kind of intensity that made it hard to remember what anyone else had just said. At 4:30, he stepped out of his office and stopped beside her desk. "Leave by 5, he said. She looked up. "I still have the foundation packet." "It can wait." "That sounds unlike you." "It is." Their eyes held. Then, lower. "Get some time to breathe before tonight." Ava almost smiled. "Is that an order?" "Yes." There was no point arguing. She went home, stood in front of her closet for too long, then chose a black dress simple enough to feel like armor, and elegant enough not to look like she was trying to disappear. She pinned her hair up, then took it down, then pinned it again. By the time she was done, the face in the mirror looked composed. Only the eyes gave away how much pressure lived underneath. The car Dominic sent arrived exactly on time. The Gala filled the lower ballroom of an old Gold Coast hotel, where everything seemed designed to remind guests they were standing inside old money, even if their own had been made last week. Marble floors, tall chandeliers, dark wood polished to a glow. Staff moving in white gloves and soft shoes. Outside camera flashes flickered at the front entrance where local media waited for board members, donors, and anyone powerful enough to photograph well. Inside the room held a quieter kind of electricity. Ava stepped through the main doors and felt conversation shift without fully stopping. Not because people knew her not yet, but because women arriving alone to this kind of room were always assessed in one fast collective glance. Dress, posture, confidence, who she might belong to. Then Dominic saw her from across the ballroom, and the rest of it vanished. He was standing near the foundation display with Grant on one side and 2 board members on the other, black suit, perfectly cut white shirt stark beneath the ballroom lights. He turned before anyone else seemed to notice why, as though some private instinct had moved ahead of sight. The board members speaking to him trailed off. Dominic was already crossing the room. Ava's breath caught for reasons that had very little to do with fear. When he reached her, his gaze moved over her once, unhurried and unhidden. Not rude, not careless. Worse than that. Appreciative in a way that made the room around them feel suddenly intimate despite the noise. "You came," he said. His voice was lower than usual, the kind he used when the sentence was meant only for her. Ava held his gaze. "You asked me to." A hint of something touched his mouth. "That dress is making it difficult to stay patient." Heat rose beneath her skin before she could stop it. "You said this room was full of important people," she murmured. "It isn't." His eyes stayed on hers another second, then he offered his arm. Ava slipped her hand through it. The movement was simple. The effect on the room was not. She felt it almost immediately. The subtle slowing of conversation nearby. The second glance from donors pretending to be interested in wine. The board chair's wife tracking them from across the floor with sudden bright curiosity. Dominic did not seem to care. He guided her through the room with one hand settling steady and sure at the small of her back when the crowd thickened. He introduced her to 3 people in fast succession, none of whom mattered enough for her to remember beyond their polished smiles and sharpened curiosity. Then Mason appeared at her shoulder in a tuxedo that somehow looked both elegant and deeply unserious. "Well," he said, looking between them, "that answers every question I had." "You have too many questions," Dominic said. "Only because life keeps rewarding me." Mason glanced at Ava, grinned, then lowered his voice. "You look terrifying in the best possible way." "Thank you," Ava said dryly. Mason leaned closer to Dominic. "Cross is here." The warmth in the evening shifted a degree colder. Dominic's hand remained where it was on Ava's back, but the fingers stilled. "Where?" "North Corridor 5 minutes ago. He's circling instead of arriving." Which means he thinks drama improves his profile. Dominic's jaw tightened. "Keep eyes on him." Mason nodded and disappeared again into the crowd. Ava turned toward Dominic. "You could tell me not to panic." He looked down at her. "Would that help?" "No. Then I won't waste the sentence." That absurdly made her want to laugh. Instead, she took a sip of water from the tray passing nearby and tried to steady herself. Dominic remained close enough that she could feel his presence, even when he was greeting donors or acknowledging trustees. There was no mistaking it now. He was not simply standing near her. He was anchoring her. As the evening moved, she learned the room the way she learned conference rooms, where tension clustered, which smiles were real, which people glanced toward Dominic with respect, and which did so with calculation. She saw the way older money deferred to him even while pretending not to. She saw the way younger men tried to mirror his stillness and failed. And several times she caught women watching her, not with cruelty, not exactly, with curiosity sharpened by surprise. Dominic Hale did not bring women into rooms like this. Apparently, he had brought her. A string quartet played near the far wall. Fundraising remarks began. Cameras flashed politely from the back. The foundation director thanked donors' children neighborhood partnerships, public commitments, long-term investment in Chicago communities. Ava listened to almost none of it. Her body had gone too alert. She felt it before she saw him. A pressure in the room, a wrongness. Then a man in a gray suit stepped into her line of sight near the corridor entrance. Nathan Cross, late 40s, maybe 50. Cleanly groomed. Silver at the temples. A smile that looked practiced enough to survive any setting. The kind of man who could stand under crystal chandeliers and still make a person think of back rooms, missing favors, and quiet knives. His eyes landed on Dominic first, then shifted to Ava, and stayed there one beat too long. Dominic moved before she fully registered it, stepping just enough to place his body between her and Cross without making a scene. Cross smiled wider. Dominic. Nathan. No one around them would have heard danger in the exchange. Ava did. Cross's gaze flicked toward her again. "You do surprise me." Dominic's voice stayed level. "Walk away." Cross gave a small laugh. "You bring a Bennett into a room like this and expect no one to notice." Ava's stomach dropped. The music still played. Glasses still clinked. The room around them still looked elegant and controlled, but something essential had changed. She could feel it in the sudden sharpening of nearby attention and the way one conversation at the next table faltered without quite stopping. Dominic took one measured step forward. Last warning. Cross studied him, then Ava, and the satisfaction in his face made her blood run cold. "Interesting," he said softly. "I knew the name would sting. I didn't realize it would matter." Before Dominic could answer, phones began lighting up across the room. One, then another, then 10. Guests glanced down. Brows tightened. Murmurs started moving like a current through the ballroom. Grant appeared at Dominic's shoulder almost instantly. "We need the side lounge," he said. Dominic's hand found Ava's elbow firm and gentle at once. "With me." They moved quickly through a side corridor into a private lounge off the ballroom, Grant ahead, Dominic beside her. Mason, arriving behind them half a breath later with his phone already open. The moment the door shut, the noise from the Gala muffled into distance. Grant turned his screen toward Dominic. Old records. A scanned article fragment from years ago. A transport investigation involving names redacted from the public version but preserved in court archive databases. Daniel Bennett's name sat there in stark black letters. Ava stared at it while the room tilted. "Someone leaked enough to make it travel," Grant said. "Not everything, just enough." Mason swore under his breath. "It's on 2 private local feeds already. The press downstairs will get it within minutes if they haven't yet." Ava's fingers went cold. "This is because of him," she said, and hated how thin her voice sounded. Dominic was already looking at her. "No," he said. "This is because of men who confuse information with power. That doesn't change what they have." Her heart was beating too hard now, too high. She looked from one face to another and saw professionalism, calculation, concern. None of it reached the raw thing inside her. She had spent years trying to build a life that belonged to her. Now, one old name, one old record, one vanished. Father was reaching up through the floorboards of the past and taking shape in the middle of a ballroom full of wealthy strangers. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered. Dominic crossed to her immediately. "Yes, you should. This is going to damage you." He stared at her for one astonished second, as if of all the possibilities in the room that one offended him most. "Ava." She shook her head. "Your board, your company, this foundation. People out there already think I'm some assistant you shouldn't have brought. Now they're going to think you dragged in a scandal tied to organized crime." Something hot and fierce flashed behind his eyes. "Let them think." The force of it stopped her. He stepped closer, close enough that the rest of the room blurred at the edges. "My reputation does not frighten me," he said. "What frightens me is the idea of you believing any of this makes you less than what you are." Ava looked at him helplessly. "You can't fix the room by saying that." "No," his voice lowered, "but I can tell you the truth inside it." The lounge had gone silent. Even Mason said nothing now. Dominic lifted one hand and touched the side of her face, not caring who saw. "None of this decides you," he said. "Not your father's mistakes, not his fear, not Cross, not a room full of bored donors looking for fresh gossip." Ava's eyes burned suddenly. She hated that. She hated crying in beautiful rooms. Dominic's thumb brushed once, just beneath one eye before any tear could fall. "Hey," he said so quietly she almost broke on the tenderness of it alone. "No." Her breath shook. "I'm trying." "I know." There was a beat where the entire room seemed to hold itself still around them. Then, very calmly, very clearly, Dominic said the one thing that changed the evening completely. "I love you." No one moved. Ava stared at him. He did not look away. Did not soften it into impulse or blame the pressure of the moment. He stood there in a private lounge off a Gala floor, while her father's name spread through the building like a stain, and gave her the truth with the same precision he gave everything else. "I should have said it before tonight," he went on quietly. "Maybe before yesterday. I didn't because I thought distance would protect you. I was wrong." The room had disappeared for her now. Grant, Mason, the phones, the leak, all of it had receded. There was only Dominic's face and the impossible steadiness in it. Ava placed her hand over his where it rested against her cheek. "I love you too." The words came out on their own as if they had been waiting longer than she had known. Something in him eased and tightened at once. He leaned down and kissed her, not carefully this time, not because he had forgotten himself, because he was done pretending memory mattered more than truth. His hand moved to her waist. Hers curled into the front of his jacket. The kiss carried too much fear, too much relief, too much certainty to be mistaken for anything temporary. It did not erase the room outside. It changed the way she could stand in it. When they parted, his forehead rested briefly against hers. Behind them, Mason let out a slow breath. "Well," he murmured, because apparently even revelations could not make him completely reverent. "That does simplify my read on the situation." Dominic did not look away from Ava. "What are the exits?" Grant answered. "Rear service staff corridor, main ballroom." Mason checked his phone. "Main ballroom is already buzzing. Someone outside definitely got the story." 2 reporters just asked whether Dominic Hale is leaving with the Bennett girl. Ava closed her eyes for 1 second. Then Dominic's hand tightened around hers. When she opened them again, he was watching her. "If you want to leave, we leave now," he said. She believed him absolutely. He would take her out a side corridor, put her in a car, shut down every question at the door, and spend the rest of the night making sure nothing reached her. And for 1 fragile second, that was exactly what she wanted. Then she thought of Cross in the ballroom, of all those curious faces, of the old pattern her life had been built on, men deciding in closed rooms what version of the truth she could survive. She looked at Dominic. No. His expression changed by the smallest degree. "No," she repeated. "I'm not running out the back because a man with old records thinks he can humiliate me." Something fierce and proud moved through Dominic's face so briefly she might have missed it if she did not know him now. "All right," he said. Mason looked between them. "I love this for us and hate it for logistics." Grant ignored him. "If you go back out, stay center line. No corridor stops." Dominic's hand slid fully into Ava's fingers, linking with a certainty that steadied her better than any prepared speech could have. He looked at her once more, giving her the choice a final time without words. Ava squeezed his hand. Not to leave, to stay. Then they walked back into the ballroom together. Conversation stopped in waves. Not all at once. That would have been theatrical. This was worse. One cluster, noticing then another. A glass lowering midway to a mouth. A whispered name. A phone tilted down. A donor pretending not to stare and failing. Dominic did not slow. He led Ava straight through the center of the room, hand locked with hers, gaze-level expression, unreadable in the way powerful men learn when they are done asking permission from the crowd. Cross stood near the far side of the floor with a drink in his hand and a smile that vanished the moment he saw them. Because this was not what he had wanted. He had wanted distance, shame, containment, a crack to widen. Instead, Dominic Hale was walking beside Ava Bennett in full view of half the city's money, as if daring every person in the room to misunderstand and survive the mistake. A trustee approached, too curious to help himself. "Dominic," he began. Voice pitched with false concern. "There seems to be some confusion among the guests." Dominic stopped just long enough to look at him, then tell them to be less easily confused. The man blinked, laughed weakly, moved aside. Ava should have been shaking. Instead, she felt strangely calm now, as if once the room had chosen to look the worst part was over. Dominic leaned slightly toward her as they continued across the floor. "You all right?" She looked up at him. "Ask me after I survive the next 10 feet. The corner of his mouth moved. Then he guided her toward the front steps of the ballroom where donors had earlier posed for photos beneath the foundation backdrop. Cameras still lingered there. Not many. Enough. Grant moved ahead to clear a path. Mason hovered somewhere off to the side, looking like a man half prepared to tackle a journalist and half prepared to enjoy it. Someone called Dominic's name. He turned, not to a reporter, to Cross. The gray-suited man stood a short distance away, smile restored but thinner now. "You really want to attach your house to hers," Cross said. The ballroom held its breath. Dominic's voice did not rise. "It already is." Cross's eyes flicked to Ava, then back to him. "Then your enemies will know exactly where to look." Ava felt Dominic's hand tighten once around hers. When he spoke again, his tone remained calm enough to be lethal. "They already do. That's why this ends badly for anyone who tries." Cross held his gaze for one beat too long, then looked away first. That more than anything changed the room. Power recognized power. Fear recognized certainty. Everyone watching understood, even if they did not know the history, that something had just been settled without a single raised voice. Dominic turned slightly toward the cameras. Not to perform, to stand. Ava stood beside him. No speech, no explanation, no apology. Just the unmistakable image of Dominic Hale, choosing where he stood and whom he stood with. For the first time that night, Ava did not feel like a name carried into the room by someone else's past. She felt like a woman making a choice in public and surviving it. Much later, when the ballroom had thinned, and the first version of the story had already begun to circulate beyond the hotel, Dominic guided her out through a secured side corridor to avoid the remaining press at the front. His hand never left hers, neither did his attention. And when the elevator doors closed on the private level above the service hall, shutting out the noise of donors' cameras, and men like Nathan Cross, Ava finally let herself exhale. Dominic turned toward her in the enclosed quiet. For a moment he only looked at her. Then gently he touched the side of her face. "You were magnificent tonight." Ava let out a breath that almost became a laugh. "I felt like I was being skinned alive in couture." His thumb moved once along her cheekbone. "Still magnificent." The elevator opened onto a restricted lounge floor where Grant was waiting with his phone in hand, and a look that told her the night was not finished, only changed shape. He glanced from Dominic to Ava, read whatever he needed to read in 1 second, and said, "We found the rest of the archive." Ava felt the world sharpen again. Dominic looked at him. "Here." Grant nodded once. "There's more about Daniel Bennett," he said. Ava went very still. More. Not rumor, not gossip, not Nathan Cross and his appetite for old names. Something real. Grant held up the folder. And this time, when Dominic looked at Ava before taking it, the weight in his face was not fear for the room they had just survived. It was for the truth that had waited beyond it. Grant led them into a smaller private sitting room off the restricted floor. No cameras, no donors, no chandeliers. Just warm lamplight, dark leather, and the distant hum of the hotel working through its walls. Ava sat because her knees had started to feel unreliable. Dominic remained standing for a moment, one hand at the back of the chair beside her, as if he had not quite decided whether staying on his feet would help him control what came next. Grant placed the folder on the low table between them and opened it with more care than the worn cardboard probably deserved. Inside were scanned records, handwritten notes, an old incident report, and something folded into a clear sleeve. Paper. A letter. Ava looked at it and felt something inside her draw tight. Grant spoke quietly. "Cross pushed out the version of your father's story that made noise. We found the rest. The part he either didn't have or didn't think people would wait long enough to understand." Dominic finally sat down across from her, close enough that if she reached out, she could have touched his hand. She almost did. Grant turned the first page toward her. Daniel Bennett was working transport for a distribution company that looked clean on the surface. It wasn't. A portion of the routes had been folded into side operations for men tied to an older outfit on the west side. At the time, Dominic was not running everything yet. He was taking over pieces of a structure that had enemies in every corner, and very few people he trusted. Ava lifted her eyes to Dominic. He said nothing. Grant continued. "One of those routes turned into a setup. Wrong cargo, wrong timing, wrong warehouse. It was supposed to look like a routine transfer and end with Dominic walking into an ambush." Ava felt the air leave her lungs slowly. Grant slid another paper forward. It was a photocopy of a statement. Half redacted, hard to read, harder to absorb. "Your father saw enough to understand something was off," Grant said. "Not all of it. Enough." He heard names he recognized, realized the route had been altered, and did the one thing nobody expected from a man in his position. Ava's voice came out quiet. "What?" Grant looked at Dominic this time. Dominic answered himself. "He warned me." The room went still. Ava stared at him. "He shouldn't have known how to reach me," Dominic said. "But men around me were easier to find then, sloppier. He found the right one sent word, and when I hesitated, he came in person." Ava looked from his face to the file and back again. "My father came to you to save your life." Dominic's jaw tightened slightly. Yes, Ava could barely hear her own voice. "And afterward, Dominic said the men he crossed started asking questions. Not loudly. Men like that never begin loudly. He understood what that meant before anyone had to explain it." Grant unfolded the paper in the clear sleeve and handed it to Ava with both hands like something breakable. "It's a note from Daniel," he said. "Scanned years ago and stored with the file." Ava looked down. The handwriting was uneven, hurried in places, stronger in others. The paper had yellowed along the folds. She could feel Dominic watching her, but all of her attention had narrowed to the page. "If this reaches the right hands, then I need one thing and one thing only. My wife and daughter stay out of it. I got myself near the wrong men trying to make honest money, and I will carry that. They won't. If I disappear, it means I made the best choice I had left. If there is any debt owed, let it be paid forward to them, not back to me." Her vision blurred halfway through. At the bottom, beneath the final line, was her father's name, Daniel Bennett, written in ink that had once been dark and certain. Ava pressed her lips together too hard. The room held very still around her. She had spent years trying to reduce her father to something manageable. A wound, a flaw, a man too weak to stay. It had been easier to hate an absence than to keep wondering what shape love could take when it looked like leaving. Now she was holding proof that his leaving had not been clean cowardice or cold abandonment. It had been terror, choice, sacrifice, and whatever else a man felt when the only way to keep his child safe was to make himself vanish from her life. A sound escaped her before she meant it to. Small, broken. Dominic moved without hesitation. 1 second he was across from her. The next he was kneeling in front of her chair, taking the letter carefully from her hands so it would not crumple between her fingers as they began to shake. Ava covered her face. She hated crying in front of people. Dominic knew that. She knew he knew. He did not mention it, did not tell her to breathe or calm down or be brave. He simply reached for her and pulled her forward until she let herself fall against him. His arms went around her, solid and warm and impossibly steady. Ava pressed her forehead into his shoulder and let the grief come the way it wanted to. Not dramatic, not loud. Worse than that. Deep and helpless and long delayed. All those years of not knowing opening at once and spilling through the smallest cracks. "My whole life," she whispered against his shirt. "I thought he just left." Dominic's hand moved slowly along her back. "I know. I hated him for it." His voice stayed low, close to her hair. He would have accepted that if it meant you lived long enough to feel anything else later. That broke her harder. She clutched his jacket with both hands and cried in earnest. Then, the kind that leaves your chest aching and your body light with exhaustion after. Grant stepped quietly out of the room at some point. She barely registered it. She only knew that Dominic never once loosened his hold. When the worst of it had passed, she leaned back enough to breathe, though not enough to leave the circle of his arms. Her eyes felt raw. Her face probably looked worse. Dominic took a folded handkerchief from his pocket and gave it to her without a word. Ava let out one shaky, humorless laugh. "You carry one of those." His thumb brushed a tear from the edge of her cheek before it could fall properly. "I carry a lot of things." She looked at him then, really looked, at the man who had built himself into something the city feared. The man who had carried her father's note in a secure archive for years. The man who had seen her name on a resume and recognized not just risk, but an old promise arriving in the shape of a woman he could not stop wanting. Ava took the handkerchief and wiped at her face. "Why didn't you tell me all of it last night?" He sat back on his heels, slightly still close. "Because you had already taken enough truth at once. That is not a full answer. No. A faint shadow crossed his face. The full answer is that some of it belonged to your father, and I wanted to be sure it was something you could choose to hear. Not something thrown at you because a man like Cross wanted spectacle. That mattered more than she expected. Ava swallowed. Did my mother know? Dominic hesitated. Some of it. Not all. Enough to understand that staying north, staying quiet, and keeping your name out of the wrong rooms was the safest path. So she was protecting me too. Yes. Ava leaned back into the chair and stared at the folded letter in Dominic's hand. All this time I thought everyone was hiding the truth because they didn't trust me with it. Dominic looked at the paper for a moment before answering. Sometimes people hide the truth because they think love makes them responsible for the damage it causes. Ava heard the self-indictment in that and lifted her eyes. You mean you? Yes? No deflection, no smile, no attempt to make the line easier. She let out a tired breath. You do know that gets very hard to argue with. His mouth moved slightly at one corner. That has not stopped you before. No. Good. The room softened by half a degree. Not because the hurt had lessened, because now it was shared. Ava looked down at her hands. What happens now? The question sat between them larger than the room. Dominic rose at last and took the chair beside hers instead of the one across from her. Close, not crowding, not distant. Careful in the way he had learned to be only with her. He placed the letter back into the folder with slow precision, then rested his forearms on his thighs and looked at her fully. Now, he said you decide what you want your life to look like after tonight. Ava frowned faintly. That sounds suspiciously reasonable. It is the most difficult thing I've said to you. She blinked. He went on before she could respond. If you want to leave Hale Group, you leave with a full recommendation and more money than any transition requires. If you want another city, I make that happen. If you want distance from me, I give it to you. If you want to stay, you stay with every protection I can place around you, and none of the lies. Ava stared at him. The words should have comforted her. Instead, they hurt in a fresh way because he was offering her freedom with the face of a man already prepared to lose something. You think I'm going to walk away? I think after everything I should let the choice belong entirely to you. Ava held his gaze for a long second. Outside the room, the hotel moved through the late hour in softened sounds. Dishes somewhere in service corridors. A distant elevator. Shoes passing now and then beyond the door. Inside, Dominic sat very still and offered her the one thing he had been worst at since the day she met him. Control of the outcome. Ava looked down again, then back at him. No. Something changed in his face, small and sudden. No, she repeated stronger now. I'm not leaving because men built half my life out of fear and silence. I'm not doing that part again. Dominic did not move. Ava leaned toward him, elbows on her knees, the tears drying cold on her skin. For years, my father made decisions without me because I was too little to decide anything. Then my mother did. Then you did. She shook her head, not accusing now, just honest. I understand why. I even understand how love got tangled up in all of it. But I'm done having my life handled at a distance. His eyes never left hers. Then tell me what you want. The question landed deep. Ava looked at him, at the controlled strength of him, at the exhaustion he had not hidden very well tonight, and at the tenderness that still lived under all of it, no matter how hard he tried to cage it. I want the truth, she said, even when it's ugly. You'll have it. I want respect, not protection disguised as permission. A flicker of something like approval moved through his gaze. You'll have that too. Ava took one slow breath. And I want you. The silence that followed was unlike the others. Not tense, not uncertain. Full. Dominic's head dipped once almost imperceptibly as if he was absorbing the sentence physically before trusting himself to answer. When he did, his voice had gone rough. You already have me. Ava felt the edge of a smile through the ache in her chest. That sounded almost vulnerable. It was. She gave a quiet laugh and looked away for 1 second because looking at him directly had become dangerous all over again. When she looked back, he had not moved, only softened. He reached for her hand, then slowly enough to let her stop him if she wished. She laced her fingers through his. A simple gesture. It changed everything. Dominic looked at their joined hands, then back at her. There's something else. Ava's heart tightened instinctively. More. Yes. His thumb moved once over her knuckles. It isn't about your father. She waited. When you started here, I told myself keeping you close was practical. Ava almost smiled. We both know that didn't last long. No, he exhaled. It became impossible the day I realized I was measuring meetings by where you sat in the room. That warm, dangerous pull returned beneath her ribs. Dominic continued quieter now. I have built my life around being the man who sees the weakness before anyone else does. With you, I stopped caring what it cost me to have one. Ava swallowed. You're talking like I should be frightened. You should be informed. Despite everything, she laughed softly. That got him, too. A real, brief smile that made the room feel less like fallout and more like the beginning of something no one had planned correctly. Then the door opened. Mason stepped in first, saw the state of Ava's face the way she and Dominic were sitting the folder on the table, and immediately lost all trace of comedy. Am I interrupting? Yes, Dominic said. Mason ignored that and looked at Ava. Are you all right? The sincerity in it surprised her enough to answer honestly. Not exactly, but I will be. He nodded once, accepting that as if it were a professional report. Grant entered behind him with his phone in hand. Cross is gone from the hotel. Press is being managed. Legal is leaning on the worst of the feeds. Ava looked up. Can they make it disappear? Grant's expression was calm, not entirely. Dominic's hand tightened slightly around hers. Grant went on. But they can make it less profitable to keep twisting. Most people only care if the story keeps moving. Mason folded his arms. And if Cross tries to make it move again, I get to be deeply unpleasant about it. Dominic looked at him. Try not to enjoy that sentence too much. No promises. For once, the exchange did exactly what it was supposed to do. It let some of the pressure out. Grant set another envelope on the table. This was in the archive box as well. Belongs to Ava. After he and Mason left, Dominic handed it to her. Inside was an old photograph, slightly bent at one corner. A summer day washed pale by time. A younger Daniel Bennett crouched beside a little girl on a curb somewhere in bright sunlight, his hand around hers as she held a melting popsicle and grinned at the camera with missing teeth. Ava stared at the image until it blurred again. I don't remember this, she whispered. Dominic looked at the photograph, then at her. Memory doesn't owe us fairness. She nodded slowly and slipped the photograph back into the envelope with shaking care. By the time they left the hotel, the city had deepened into that late hour when Chicago felt all bones and light. The wind off the river cut clean through coats. Dominic's car waited in a private lane beneath the service entrance engine running driver, already looking away for privacy the moment they approached. Ava assumed he was taking her home. Instead, when the car turned south along the river and kept going, she looked at him. Where are we going? My place. The words should have startled her more than they did. Ava leaned back into the leather seat and watched the city slide by in reflected streaks across the windows. Neither of them spoke much during the drive. They did not need to. Their hands remained linked between them on the seat the entire way. Dominic's penthouse sat high enough above the city that the elevator ride felt detached from gravity. When the doors opened, warm light spilled across dark wood floors and long panes of glass that turned Chicago into an ocean of moving stars. Ava stepped inside slowly. The place was exactly what she would have expected if someone had told her to imagine power-taught restraint. Expensive without being loud, clean lines, deep colors, art that looked chosen, not collected for approval, a bar in the corner, bookshelves. No family photographs in sight. Dominic removed his jacket and draped it over the back of a chair. Sit, he said then, seeing the way she looked at him, added more gently, please. Ava sat on the edge of the sofa, still holding the envelope with the old photograph inside. Dominic poured water and handed her a glass. Only after she took it did he sit across from her, one elbow resting on his knee, studying her with a steadiness that no longer felt like something she needed to survive alone. The city lights moved across the windows behind him. He was quiet long enough that she finally asked, "What?" His gaze did not shift. "I am trying to decide whether saying this tonight is selfish." Ava set the water on the low table. "That depends on what it is." He inhaled slowly. "Stay here." She blinked once. "Tonight." "Yes." Then, after a beat with more honesty than strategy, "And after tonight if you want." The room changed around the sentence. Ava looked at him very carefully. Dominic leaned back slightly, one hand braced against the arm of the chair, as if he was making himself stay there instead of crossing to her. "You need space where no one asks questions through walls," he said. "No sidewalks, no trains, no lobby cameras waiting to connect your face to a headline. You need a door that stays locked and a place where nobody gets near you without going through me." Ava arched a brow despite herself. "That sounds part practical and part possessive." "Yes." The answer came so dryly that she nearly smiled. He held her gaze. "There's more." "I assumed." His expression softened by a degree. "I don't want to take you back to an apartment where you'll be alone with everything that happened tonight." Ava felt that line settle somewhere deep and tender. He was not asking because he wanted to win proximity. He was asking because he could imagine the silence waiting for her there, and hated it on her behalf. Dominic looked toward the window once, then back at her. "If you stay," he said, "it's not as an employee sleeping in the spare room because circumstances got complicated. It's because I love you, and because the idea of waking up tomorrow with you somewhere else feels wrong, in a way I have stopped wanting to fight." Ava sat very still. No one had ever spoken to her quite like that. Not with ornament. Not with control. Just with the full dangerous sincerity of a man who had finally decided that saying the truth mattered more than managing its consequences. She rose from the sofa and crossed the room. Dominic stood the second she reached him, as if sitting while she approached would have been impossible. Ava stopped in front of him and looked up. "If I stay," she said softly, "I'm not staying as someone hidden behind your office door either. You won't be. If I stay, this changes things. I know. At work, too." He nodded. "I know that as well." Ava searched his face. "And you already thought about that?" "Yes." A faint laugh escaped her. "Of course you did." Dominic's eyes warmed slightly. "I'm not good at improvising where you're concerned." She shook her head, smiling now despite the ache and fatigue and everything tonight had pulled open. "That is not true at all. It feels true from my side." Ava lifted a hand and placed it against his chest. His heartbeat met her palm. Strong, a little too fast. Human. "What happens at work?" she asked. His hand came over hers without hesitation. "You won't remain my assistant." The words might have sounded like rejection from another man. From him in this moment they sounded like respect. Dominic went on. "You're too sharp for that role, and you've proven it every week you've been there." Grant has been saying the same thing, though less eloquently. "I want you in strategy and development somewhere. Your instincts matter on paper, as much as they already do in every room." Ava stared at him. "You had a whole plan." His mouth curved faintly. "I had a thought." "You had an entire internal proposal, didn't you?" A pause. "That depends on how generous your definition of proposal is." She laughed, then real and unguarded for the first time in hours, and the sound seemed to hit him somewhere tender, because he closed his eyes briefly as if relieved by it. When he opened them, the expression there was almost unbearably warm. Ava's voice softened. "You really were planning to move me?" "Yes." "Before or after you admitted you loved me?" "Before." He gave her a look. The second part complicated the memo. She laughed again, and then, because the room felt too full for anything else, she rose onto her toes and kissed him. Dominic answered immediately, hands settling at her waist with a familiarity that no longer felt shocking, only right. The kiss was slower than the ones before, stripped of adrenaline, now full of choice and exhaustion and relief. The kind of kiss people give when they have stepped through fire and found each other standing on the other side. When they parted, he rested his forehead lightly against hers. "Stay," he whispered. Ava did not make him ask again. Yes. The word changed his whole face. Not dramatically. More dangerous than that. Relief moved through him like something long denied permission. He drew her into his arms and held her close, one hand at the back of her head, the other firm at her waist as if some part of him still needed the physical proof that she was real, and here and choosing this. Later, after she had changed into one of his shirts and washed the last of the ballroom from her skin, she found him standing by the windows with 2 cups of tea he had probably made himself because the kitchen was too precise to belong to anyone else. She took the cup from him and stood beside him. Chicago stretched below them in midnight lines and river light. Sirens moved somewhere distant. Bridges shone. Traffic drifted. The city looked untouchable from up here. Ava rested her head lightly against his shoulder. For a while they said nothing. Then Dominic spoke, his voice low in the dark glass and warm room. When Mason asked if you had a boyfriend that day, Ava smiled against the fabric of his shirt. Yes. What were you thinking? She leaned back enough to look at him. The truth. He waited. Ava's smile deepened softly. That I didn't. Dominic's eyes held hers, and she set her cup down on the ledge behind her and touched the line of his jaw with her fingertips. And that maybe I wanted the wrong man to care. Something flickered across his face. Something unguarded and almost boyish beneath all the danger and discipline. The wrong man, he repeated. Ava kissed him once briefly, the only one. He let out a quiet breath that sounded suspiciously like a laugh and pulled her closer against his side. Below them, Chicago kept moving as if nothing in the world had shifted. But everything had. Not because danger was gone. Not because the past had magically become smaller. It hadn't. Her father was still a man who had disappeared to keep his family alive. Nathan Cross was still somewhere in the city with his appetite for old leverage. Hale Group would still wake tomorrow to whispers, rumors, and the quiet work of controlling fallout. None of that vanished. What changed was simpler and deeper. Ava was no longer standing outside her own life, waiting for other people to decide how much truth she could bear. And Dominic Hale, who had spent years mastering every room by never letting anyone too close, was no longer pretending love could be managed like risk. They stood together in the lamplit quiet of his penthouse city reflected around them in glass. And for the first time since she had answered a reckless question in a bright office hallway, Ava felt something stronger than fear. Not safety. Not exactly. Certainty. The kind that arrives only after the truth has done its worst, and you are still there, still standing, still chosen. Dominic kissed the top of her head. Ava closed her eyes. This time, when the night settled around them, it did not feel like something waiting to take. It felt like something finally willing to keep.